Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Mazzucca. I'm from Washington University in St. Louis, and I'm happy to share with you a little bit of information about study designs, specifically thinking about them being applied to implementation science research. And this is definitely a topic that is going to scratch the surface here, and I will hopefully provide you with some resources to guide you in the right direction for when you need to or would like to learn more about this. I'm going to turn off my video so you can see the whole screen, this is my introduction. Okay. So within this presentation, we'll think first about why we should care about choosing a study design carefully, how it relates to some of the other factors that are going on within your study, and then think about some specifics of different types of designs. And here I'm mostly focusing on quantitative designs, so quantitative and experimental designs, where you're thinking about testing the effect of some of implementation strategies on relevant implementation outcomes. There are a lot of other types of non-experimental approaches to doing implementation research, but mostly that's what we'll cover here. And we'll wrap up with some introduction to the very many resources that are available to support you in making study design. In terms of when I think about what you need to think about to choose a study design, I think about three different things. So first, what is your research question? And I know that kind of sounds simplistic and a little bit, duh, that's what I am doing here, answering research questions. But really focusing in on a carefully crafted research question and sticking to that will make all the rest of your study design choices a lot easier because you have a focus and you know what you're trying to do. Second, we think about what type of evidence you need. And there are going to be a lot of different factors that play into that you're going to want to pay attention to. And then the last one is thinking about what levels your implementation strategies and your intervention or whatever program policy, whatever you would like to call it, the thing is sometimes what it's referred to, how they operate, and thinking about whether they're organizational level or individual level or both sets of strategies. Here, just to think about what it means to be doing D&I research, we can think about the continuum of different types of studies, thinking about pre-intervention studies, whether a program could work, is it even feasible, to then efficacy and effectiveness studies that receive a lot of the focus of our traditional research training. And then moving into this big yellow box, this is an image from one of the readings from the annual reviews of public health that Brown and colleagues put out a few years ago. And I think it's really interesting and helpful to think about why we're moving up from efficacy and effectiveness studies into D&I research, thinking about generalized knowledge, making a program work within the real world. So we're increasing the real world relevance of our work as we move in to these different phases of research, and hopefully actually thinking about the real world relevance from the beginning, even when we're in an efficacy mindset. So some of the research questions that we would think about within a D&I setting are perhaps what is the most relevant strategy to a population or that fits with a certain evidence-based intervention or EBI. Thinking about the different factors that impede or support the implementation of an evidence-based intervention or policy and how you can operate within the context of those. And then third, thinking about just, does it work? Can these sets of strategies improve relevant implementation outcomes for an intervention? And then last, thinking about sustainment. So thinking about not only what's needed for initial uptake of an evidence-based intervention, but what is needed for it to be implemented over a long period of time. And these research questions are quite a bit different than what you would see in an efficacy study. So if we randomize people to take a pill, does that have some intended outcome? So you're kind of taking a step back and thinking about how the giving of that pill is fitting into the overall clinical context. And here, depending on the amount of research training you've had, you may or may not have learned a little bit about internal versus external validity. So when we're thinking, there's a big push in implementation science to think about the external validity of our research. And I always like to just take a second and think about what that actually means. So on the left, this blue lab image is thinking about internal validity, and the universe picture to the right is thinking about external validity. So what internal validity means is that the results the results that you find represent the truth in your study. So you're able to accurately assess exactly what's going on within your study, your closed system, your tightly controlled environment. That's great, and you want to know that what you're doing as the experimenter is having some sort of measured effect. But you also want to think about things that are happening outside of your control as a researcher. So do the results that you see in your study, does the truth, whatever the truth is according to your study, is that true for other truths in other parts of the universe? Thinking about there, kind of what that means in a real world setting, is do the causal relationships that you see hold for different people, different settings, different sorts of programs, other outcomes? You can kind of think about, switching things up a little bit, and do your results that you see hold for other groups and other places. There's always a balance of factors that will increase internal or external validity within your study. And so it's almost painted as a tension between the two within one research study. But you want to be thinking about, within implementation science, having a little bit more focus on external validity. You can also think about what your research question is and how this will impact your study design in terms of the types of comparisons you want to make. So this is thinking about the types of studies where you're testing the effect of an implementation or dissemination strategy in some sort of fashion. So here you could do this in testing the difference by group or by time. So thinking about having perhaps two different groups, one getting one set of implementation strategies and one getting another. So you're testing differences in those. Maybe they get something versus nothing. Maybe they get thing A versus thing B. And you assess these groups before and after they receive these strategies. And then you're able to see what, typically that's how it happens, but you're looking here at the contrast between the two groups. Implicit there, I kind of stumbled, is that you're also looking there by time. You could also look at just one group and follow one group. You give them the same implementation strategy and look before and after and see what happened. So there are changes over time, and then looking at the contrast between two different types of implementation strategies or lack thereof. And these sorts of decisions, whether you're looking at a comparison between two different strategies, or if you're just looking within one group, looking at the changes over time, that's going to drive the type of study design that you choose. You also want to think about the type of evidence that you need. And evidence here can mean a couple different things. So what first comes to mind when I think about this is whether or not you need quantitative data, qualitative data, or both, and kind of a subset of that category where the Venn diagram overlaps is our bucket called mixed methods. So this can be driven by the type of information that you would like, that your funders would like, that your stakeholders care about. It can be informed by lots of different things, but you're thinking here about whether or not how much of each of these types of data you want. Quantitative data being really good at focusing on the what and the how much. So the did this work, yes or no, is a really great way of quantitative data is great at answering that. Qualitative information is really great for getting all of the rich contextual information. There's a really strong focus, as I'm sure you've seen, in implementation science about context. So the local context driving, pretty much to a large degree the success of your implementation efforts or not. And that's going to give you information about how, why, all of the kind of the nuances of your setting and what is happening within the context of your implementation study. You can combine the two, so you can simply have a combination of quantitative and qualitative information, or you can use this specific approach, taking a mixed methods approach to your research, where you're using the combination of quantitative and qualitative data to inform each other and to triangulate what is happening within your setting. There's lots of guidance about how to use a mixed methods approach. It's not simply collecting the two in tandem in order to get the biggest bang for your buck in combining these two. Mixed methods approaches have very particular strategies for collecting, quantitative data that then informs a qualitative data collection effort, and then how you combine and synthesize those results together. I can point you towards resources for mixed methods approaches if that is of interest to you. As I mentioned, part of the decision about the type of data you will need is dependent on what your stakeholders would like. So I cannot overemphasize, I cannot say this enough, that your stakeholders are so important, so largely important in implementation research. They are going to be the people who you rely on to implement your evidence-based program, policy, intervention. They're the people that you're actually trying to support. And these people can be a number of different types. They can be individual medical providers, other people within the work unit of a clinical setting, hospital administrators, local health department practitioners. So they can be kind of at multiple levels. They can be the end user, so they could be a patient or a community member. You want to make sure that you have all of the stakeholders identified and engaged in some way to identify what they need and what matters to them. This will drive a lot of the decisions in terms of the study design that you pick, because you have to have something that is acceptable and ethical within D&I research, well, within all research, but especially D&I research, because presumably you already have an evidence-based intervention that you're working with. So it's not really ethical to say, well, I would like to give you something, but not you something, thinking about randomizing people to either getting an implementation strategy or not. So kind of the ethical and practical considerations of doing this work in real world settings is really a lot different than efficacy research. So you want to make sure that you have a great relationship with your stakeholders so that you're collecting the right information, collecting things that matter to them, that can help them make decisions, and so that they will actually be engaged in your research along the way. And then thinking about this levels consideration. So when we think about efficacy research, we think about perhaps, again, taking individuals, having them be randomized to an active pill or a placebo, and then we measure the change in their health outcomes. That's kind of the individual level intervention strategy, and then where we measure the outcomes. When we're thinking about implementation research, we're thinking about how can we get providers to change their prescribing behavior so then the individual receives some sort of evidence-based intervention or treatment, etc. So by nature there, we're already thinking about multiple levels as we see here on this figure. So we're already thinking automatically about the providers changing their behaviors. Those providers are nested within hospital systems, and then within larger regulatory environments that drive whether or not they're allowed to prescribe or can get reimbursed for different services. So you're thinking about just that one pill, and that one intervention treatment being nested within a lot of different hierarchical levels of influence. And in implementation research, we're thinking about how can we intervene on those higher levels with our implementation strategies to then have some sort of intended effect of either uptake or sustainment of an evidence-based treatment. Because we're operating at these multiple levels, that's often where our action is with our implementation strategies. We want to make sure that we're measuring the change at those levels. So we're not just intervening at the organizational or provider level, but only measuring changes in individual health outcomes, so patient level outcomes only. We have to be thinking about measuring the changes that we're actually doing with our implementation strategies. I always like to say this D&I is inherently multi-level, so we have to be thinking about keeping all of those levels straight. So that's kind of a crash course in the types of things that you have to think about in order to make a decision about study designs. And next we'll walk through a couple of the big buckets of study designs, just to give you a taste for what those are like. I'll talk about them within that Brown and colleagues framework of within site, between site, or within and between site research designs. I think separating those out into the three broader categories is really helpful, because you're thinking about whether you're measuring a change within one site or a similar set of sites that have all been receiving some similar implementation strategy set. Then you're looking at those that are comparing between two different groups. That was our by group comparison. These have different exposures. You can think about it in a traditional epidemiologic sense. Or you can combine the two and look at both differences between different groups and over time. So one of the within site designs that is really helpful is the interrupted time series. And before I launch into this, I should clarify that a lot of times what we see with implementation science, experimental designs, a lot of times it can simply be a cluster randomized trial. That's perfectly acceptable and can be well suited to a lot of research questions. What I'm going to go through here is some of the alternatives that you might consider so that we're not always falling back on a randomized control trial when in fact there might be another design that's better suited to answer our research question. So this is kind of food for thought, but know that all of our traditional research designs can still be applied to implementation science. So here, this interrupted time series, what we're doing here is collecting multiple data collection points over a long period of time. And usually this is done with fairly granular levels of data. It works really well when you have data that's kind of already collecting itself. Administrative data, any sorts of data that's ongoing in its collection that you as a researcher are not seeking out. So you have this kind of X's and O's notation here. The O's are the data collection or observation points, and they're numbered from 1 on in terms of what time point that is. And then this X here indicates that something happened. So this is perhaps an evidence-based intervention was disseminated or implemented, whatever that looks like in the context of your research. And what you're able to do is look and see and at the change, perhaps, compliance with a policy. You can look at compliance beforehand in some sort of set of organizations, and then map where the policy mandate, so the regulation changed, and then look to see over time afterwards, as that policy is implemented, does it have its intended effect of improving compliance with some sort of standard? So you would hear the analysis behind this is to compare the slopes before and after. I'll say this again later, but your best, the best advice you can get when thinking about some of these quantitative designs and really all sorts of study designs, make friends with a biostatistician. You can never have too many biostatistician friends. They will help you with all of this heavy lifting on the quantitative side of things. So that's thinking about just one example of a within site. So here, all of these, all of the units that are contributing to data collection here have been exposed to this same policy mandate. So a within site design. One example of a between site design would be a factorial design. And here what you're doing is looking at the combination of several implementation strategies at one time. So you can kind of think about it as on a 2x2 table for a 2x2 factorial design. Have one implementation strategy in two different forms or two different intensities, and same thing for another implementation strategy. So this is implementation strategy IS, A or B, and two different levels therein. And you would then assign, perhaps randomly, your units, your organizations, your hospitals, your work units to one of these combinations. So they're either getting, a little bit of something, a lot of bit of something, depending on how you conceptualize these different levels. But what you're looking for there is an estimate of how well this implementation strategy on its own, so the main effect of each of these implementation strategies on your outcome, as well as the interaction of the two. You can also think about perhaps, if this was yes, no, and looking at the combination of the two, you could perhaps hypothesize that doing nothing is not really worth testing because it probably will not lead to meaningful changes. So you could in fact leave that arm out, and what you would have there is an incomplete factorial design. And there are statistical ways of working around that. So again, that's thinking about, what is your specific research question and whether or not, this full or incomplete factorial is more appropriate. Another one of these between site designs that is pretty popular is the SMART design. So that's sequential multiple assignment randomized implementation design, which is why we call it SMART, because that's a mouthful. And it's a subset of the factorial experiment. And here you're not just looking at the combination of implementation strategies, but their sequence. So you can optimize the order and the delivery of your implementation strategies using this sort of a design. And the really nice thing about this is that I'll walk you through this example. What you do here is you randomize group organizations into two groups, either getting one implementation strategy or another. And then at some pre-specified time, you assess how everyone's doing. So whether or not they're responding to the implementation strategies that you have given them. If they respond, that's great. That means that that implementation strategy is of positive, is a benefit to that group, and they can continue on. So same thing for each of the two implementation strategies on this screen. If they don't respond, you have the opportunity to randomize them to get something else. So this is really nice because thinking about our longer randomized trials, you think about having to wait until the end of the study to figure out if something was actually working, if people were responding to what you're doing. And with this, you're able to have a pre-specified point where you can modify what you're doing to improve the implementation of your intervention. Maybe it's just that they need more time. So maybe these are your quick responders, maybe these are your slow responders. Maybe they need something else. Maybe they need not just a basic, but a more intense implementation strategy for that group. So you're able to then randomize. Typically what you see is either more of the same or some sort of modification. And then you can look at the different sequences, so who got what and when, and understand what combinations and sequencing of implementation strategies are most useful to your setting. This one is really nice and it's super fancy, but there are a lot of really thoughtful decision points and a lot of information that you need. So make sure you have a really good biostatistician or some sort of quantitative person on your project for this. And one of the other types that is increasing in popularity is the stepped wedge. And this is one of a type of rollout design, which is a broader category of designs where the implementation strategies are given out over some period of time. They're not all implemented at the beginning of your active intervention period. And what you're doing here essentially is randomizing or assigning the time that a group of organizations receives your implementation strategies. So at some point, everyone will get it. You just have to think about what group you're in, and that drives what time when you get the implementation strategies and intervention. This is a particularly appealing one when you're going to stakeholders and saying, it's not a matter of getting something versus nothing as you might in a traditional RCT, but here you're saying it's not just will you get it, it's a matter of when. And there can still be some ethical considerations and practical considerations for those people who are, really eager beavers and want to get going on change very quickly. They still might not be okay being randomized to a later group, but it at least lets everyone have the opportunity to get the active implementation and intervention strategies that you're testing. What you do here is have groups of time. So here is seen as, a couple months of just a run-in period for everyone, and then several months blocks of time where you have 3 groups who have data collection at baseline. That's this little arrow that means measurement. And then at each time that a group transitions from nothing to your active intervention, you do data collection on everyone. So you're able to compare what this group 1 did here in the active period versus the run-in period, and then comparing across the different groups. So you're able to have both comparisons within one group, the within site comparison, and then between these different groups to think about, over time, is there a difference between these groups that got something at different points in time? You have to have all of those measurement periods in order to do that. So it can be a little bit burdensome in terms of the amount of data that's collected from the participants. So those are kind of the specific types of study designs that I think are important to think about in terms of implementation research besides our traditional RCTs and cluster randomized trials. And then kind of in parallel is this idea of a hybrid design. And it's not necessarily that this is going to be, you will have perhaps a hybrid design and one of the others that I've mentioned. But this approach to research taking hybrid designs is really great for pushing us to think, even when we're in more of a clinical effectiveness, more on the effectiveness side of our research scheme, it's important to think about what we're ultimately going to be doing with this research down the line. So it's nice in that it helps us think about what are the implementation considerations along the way and building them in through these different hybrid designs, so that when we get to implementation research, it's not that we're all of a sudden thinking about implementation considerations, we've gotten some information along the way. So these different hybrid types, you can think about it being kind of a seesaw between hybrid 1, focused more on effectiveness, less on implementation, hybrid 2, focusing equally on both, and hybrid 3, focusing more on implementation research, but still having some effectiveness research questions as well. There's a lot of information about these, how to do them, how to write research questions for these. And I think the benefit here is that you're thinking about implementation all along the way. So to summarize, this is really just to scratch the surface. There are a lot of factors that play into what study design you choose, whether or not you should and can randomize, whether you're interested in, whether you have control to give people different sets of implementation strategies, or whether you're in a more natural experiment and everyone gets the same thing. So all of those things you have to think about. As I've discussed, thinking about your research question, what evidence you need, and how your implementation strategies and interventions work. Having those clearly mapped out, this kind of overlays a lot with the theories, models, and frameworks. You can think about the unpacking the black box of these with those. These considerations will help you choose the best study design to match these different considerations within your particular setting. There's often not one right answer. There's a lot of different potentially good options. So it's good to have these considerations laid out so that you can identify those. And I think one of the other great things about D&I research is that there are a lot of study designs available. And that can be a little bit intimidating for people when they're first learning about doing research or implementation research. But I think knowing that there's a lot of tools in your D&I study design tool belt to help you answer your research question is pretty great. And again, I'll reiterate, make friends with biostats friends and people who know a lot about study designs and executing study implementation studies. As I mentioned, there are a lot of different resources. So we have an updated DIRC design toolkit. This is our dissemination and implementation research core at WashU. So we have a series of toolkits that can help you think about these different design issues. There are different groups that have supports for particular groupings of these designs. So the Penn State group has a lot of support for SMART and another related set of things called MOST that is out of the scope for today, and the Factorial designs. They're not specifically focused on implementation science versions of these, but all the same considerations apply. And then there are a few different webinar series and presentations that can help you kind of take what you've learned here and expand upon it. A couple of references that I've used for this presentation are listed here. They're really great in thinking about these kind of in a really careful, in-depth approach. Some of these are the readings that you've been assigned. And with that, thank you very much, and happy to be in contact with any of you as you go on your implementation science journeys.